Welcome to Lead with Kindness, your essential podcast for disrupting the workplace with kindness and well-being. I'm Helen Rimmer, and I'm armed with 20 years of leadership experience and a passion for positive psychology. I'm here to offer practical tips and share inspiring stories to revolutionise leadership. Ready to challenge the norm? Let's dive in and transform our workplaces together. It's time to make a difference. Let's get started. Welcome to another episode of Lead with Kindness, where we explore the power of compassionate leadership in creating thriving workplaces. Today, we have a special guest, Nicky McCrudden, an expert in leadership and learning. Nicky has spent 17 years helping workforces reconnect with learning and adding value to organisations. She founded McCrudden Partnership, working with incredible leaders and organisations. Nicky is now pursuing a PhD at the University of Chichester, focusing on developing a more humanistic style of leadership in frontline managers. We're excited to dive into her insights on compassionate leadership and much more. Welcome, Nicky.
Hi, Helen. Thank you so much for having me.
That's all right. So let's dive in. Nicky, can you start by telling our listeners a bit about your background and what sparked your interest in leadership and learning?
Oh, okay. So, the learning thing has been since I was a kid.
Yeah.
Always loved learning. My background was when I was 13, I knew what I wanted to do. I woke up one day, decided that's it, I know what I want to do. My parents weren't impressed. As it turned out, I couldn't do the one thing I had my heart set on doing. So I hadn't even planned to go to university. Then I went to university in the hope that I might still be able to do this thing because I wasn't ready to give up on my dream. And after that, it became apparent that it really wasn't going to happen. So I sort of hopped around. In 10 years, I had 13 different jobs because I just couldn't find the thing that made my heart sing. And then I started delivering training and realised I was quite good at it and it was quite good fun. And then the management bit sort of came a bit later because I was working part-time in the NHS and delivering training freelance the other days. And as I got promoted through the NHS and I became a line manager, I suddenly felt totally incompetent and thought, I'm not very good at this. And I looked around at all the other people and thought, why do they get it and I don't? So I started reading more and learning more myself because I still loved learning. And then discovered that I wasn't the only one that thought I was totally incompetent. I don't mean that other people thought I was incompetent. Yeah. But that other people were also, other managers were also thinking, I feel out of my depth here. So the NHS trust I worked in asked me if I'd do a leadership program for them.
Brilliant.
That was 2011. And I had the best fun. I think I probably learnt as much from the people on the course as they learnt from me.
I bet.
And that never stopped. Even recently, I would always go away from a course having learnt something new from the people I was working with.
Yeah, that's one of the best bits about it, isn't it?
It is, yeah, that and getting to see behind the curtain in lots of different organisations.
Yes, that's why I love it. So, you mentioned on LinkedIn having a very positive learning experience from a young age. And I should say here that we went to the same secondary school, so I'm really interested in this. This is me being nosy. So can you share a particular moment or teacher who had a significant impact on your learning journey?
Oh, I mean, like I say, I loved learning even from a little tot. And I had some phenomenally good teachers that from junior school, probably infant school as well, but I don't remember that quite so clearly. But teachers, I remember one teacher at junior school that she just connected to our class in such a way that we all felt important to her. So much so that she let slip it was her birthday, and I convinced my mum to make her a birthday cake, and we brought it in to the school. All the kids, we all clubbed together with our pocket money and paid mum for the ingredients.
Oh, amazing.
So yeah, we were really lucky. And then at our senior school, I don't know if you remember Mrs. Gray.
Yes.
She was our form tutor.
Yeah.
She was our form tutor, and you were only supposed to have your form tutor for 1 year. But she bonded with us so much, she refused to let us go. So we had her for 3 or 4 years. And we just, like I said, there was that connection.
Yeah.
that felt really important. And then probably in my undergraduate degree, I did a sports degree originally, and there was one module, biomechanics, which is the application of the law of physics to the human body and movement.
Yeah.
And initially, none of us got it. It was a class of sort of, I don't know, 60 odd students. And we were all sort of scratching our heads going, any idea what's going on? And then we got a new teacher, a chap called Adrian. And he would explain everything 3 different ways. So he would explain it in theory.
Yeah.
And then if it was, I don't know, say it was about motion, he'd get a tennis ball and he'd throw it at the wall and he'd explain it in practical terms. And then he'd explain it a different way. So if you understood it the first time, you had 2 chances to reinforce it.
Yeah.
If it didn't make sense, he gave you 2 different ways of looking at the same thing.
That's brilliant. And
we went from a year of people who didn't understand biomechanics to a year of people who all passed their module exams.
Wow.
And I genuinely believe that was because he understood that we all needed to relate to it in a slightly different way. And it fascinated me, even in my early 20s, about how he managed to capture our imagination and take something complicated that we didn't understand to something we all quite. And I ended up going to a conference presenting a paper on a biomechanics topic, and I was thinking, I don't really understand why I'm doing this, but so he obviously ignited something. So yeah, that fascinated me, how he managed to teach something complicated in a way we all got.
Yeah. So it's that mix, isn't it, of really good skill, learning, working out these tricks of the trade, so to speak, and then also that connection, like you were talking about, Mrs. Gray. I had a similar experience with Mr. Reed. Yes, and he was, just a brilliant teacher. I mean, everyone did, and everyone liked Mrs. Gray. You know, it's just there's certain teachers that we probably could list, and we'd all be going, oh yeah, and then there's the ones that just came and went from our.
I think the other thing about teaching is the enthusiasm for what you're teaching.
Oh, yes.
So at the age of 16, much to my parents, no, I was a bit younger, 15, much to my parents' dismay, I decided I wanted to learn to play the saxophone.
Oh.
It's not a quiet instrument.
No.
And I had this saxophone teacher, his name was Chris, and he lived and breathed the saxophone. He'd been in the military. He played the saxophone in military bands, on horseback. He played on cruise ships. It was just his love was saxophone. And every week I would go home and practice and practice and practice. And then he had the cheek to emigrate to America. I mean, how rude. How rude is that? Yeah. And I found another music teacher who was the loveliest man you've ever met. And he played so many instruments, and he played the piano, the guitar, the double bass, the saxophone. The saxophone was just one instrument that he played. His main love was the piano, I think. And I stopped playing about 6 months later because what I was getting from Chris was I was catching his excitement and love for this instrument. And for the other teacher, he was a lovely man, a fantastic musician. Great teacher, but he didn't have the same excitement that Chris gave. So yeah, I've never quite forgiven him for moving.
No.
My parents were thrilled.
Yes. But yeah, that authenticity of love, that true passion, isn't it?
Emotions are contagious. It's a neuroscience fact. We can't help it.
No. Totally.
So if you're learning something from someone who's genuinely excited by it, you'll catch that excitement.
Yeah, totally. Oh, brilliant. So how did your early love for learning influence your career choices and your passion for workforce development?
Oh, as I said, I'm not sure it was a career choice.
No.
As such. It was a kind of hop around and discover what I quite enjoyed doing. One of the jobs I had when I left school, I lasted 2 weeks. Because I decided I wasn't really cut out for office work at that point. I worked for a charity. I worked for the Citizens Advice Bureau, actually, training volunteers, and they sent me to London to do a train the trainer program. And I met an incredible lady called Atiti, who was the trainer on this course. And at the end of the course, she said to me, "You do really well as a freelance trainer." And I just thought, well, actually, yeah, I do kind of enjoy it.
Yeah.
And I think there's probably a little bit of a frustrated actor in me, and
Yeah.
training allows me to perform,
Yeah.
but also to share the exciting things I discovered.
Yeah.
And I think that love of learning, that making sense of the world, I get really excited when suddenly something's that's baffled me makes sense.
Yeah. Get that.
So
Yeah.
if there's been
Totally.
something that I've not been able to master in a workplace, like a project that's got away from me, or a conversation I've had with a colleague and I thought, well, that didn't go very well. When I learn something that helps me make sense of that, I get a huge dopamine hit and I get
Yeah.
very excited, and I can't wait to share it with everyone who I meet. And of course, they're wildly enthusiastic and very thrilled to hear all about it. My poor husband's usually my first target.
Yeah. We should start a support group for the husband.
Yeah, well, maybe the husband
Yeah.
should start a support group. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh. So what motivated you to found the McCrudden Partnership, and what were some of your most rewarding experiences working with organisations and leaders through your company?
So what motivated? Well, a TT was the driving force between me being a freelancer. And I know myself well enough to know that I can't do anything simply, which my poor husband also suffers quite a lot. You know, if I'm going to take up running, I don't just want to run, I want to run a marathon. Yeah, if I'm going to learn to dive, I don't just want to learn to scuba dive, I want to dive with sharks.
Yeah.
I've always got to make things difficult, is the bottom line. So when a TT suggested I was freelance, I thought, well, I don't just want to be a trainer, I want a business. And what was really fun was being able to attract a whole load of people who had the same excitement for discovering things to join the company. So we had some amazing freelance trainers. And I had one question in recruitment because I was really interested in people's values. And I'd done a Belbin course, and I was interested in which people's, who people would be attracted to. So I said to people, you know, basically I wanted people who were playful and excitable. And one of the questions was, who do you prefer and why? And one of the choices I gave people was Batman or Spider-Man. And I was kind of interested in the why. I mean, for me, Spider-Man is a rule follower, and Batman's a little bit more gregarious and a bit more. And I remember interviewing one of our trainers, and she said, oh, definitely Batman. She said, but not the 1970s Batman. She said, the modern Batman, because let's face it, who wouldn't love a man in black leather? At that moment, I just thought, she's like me. Yeah, she's just.
It's a brilliant answer.
Yeah, she just wants to make people laugh, because if people laugh when they're learning, they remember they laughed. They remember what they laughed about, and then as a trainer, half your job is done.
Absolutely.
So yeah, we still joke about that question when I see her now.
Yeah. Oh, I love that question. I'll make notes.
In terms of what was most rewarding, I was thinking about this, and there was a lot of rewarding experiences working with organisations. So at one point we had a contract to deliver redundancy support. And that was weirdly rewarding, in that you were often faced with people who were being made redundant from a public sector organisation that they'd worked for most of their lives, and they were now thinking, what am I going to do? And some of it was coaching, and we would often have tears, and some of it was training, and some people were quite enthusiastic, some people were quite angry about having to reapply for jobs. So seeing people come out the other side of that was very rewarding. Often with training, you don't get to find out what happens next. So on the odd occasion that you see people get promoted, or when people would drop you a line and say, you know, I just wanted to say thank you, we did this and it worked. But I think, if I'm honest, the most rewarding at McCrudden Partnership was the people I worked with. And I made some huge mistakes, and I didn't get it right all the time. But there were people who in the back office I worked with who'd been out of work for a while because they'd been raising children and their confidence was perhaps not where it should be for their ability. And working with them, A, it was really good fun.
Yeah.
And B, watching their development was incredible. And just getting to know them and seeing this. And then the trainer I mentioned who liked Batman in black leather was originally a first aid trainer and then started to spread her wings into more personal development. And it was amazing watching her take my material and make it her own.
I love it.
And then I'd think, oh gosh, why didn't I think of doing it that way? So some of the most rewarding stuff was being part of other people's journey in a way in our company, because often with clients you don't find out what happens.
No. Oh, that's wonderful. So next question, can you discuss a successful case in which you helped an organisation reconnect with learning and how this impacted staff motivation and organisational value?
Yeah, I mean, we were very lucky to work with an NHS organisation in London, and the learning and development team in-house are phenomenal. They are just amazing. The organisation had been through, as many NHS organisations have been through, a really difficult time. They weren't doing particularly well in their staff survey. And they originally came to us for a leadership programme, which we did, and it was really exciting. And we had really good results. We had people who were getting promotion, people who were, she told me that for the first time ever, they had a waiting list for training courses. She said they'd never had one before.
Oh, what a dream.
Yeah, they had a waiting list for people wanting to come on our leadership programme. And I mean, it helped to have such a great partnership with the internal staff. And they shared so much in terms of their internal reports and things like that. When they did a report, they would share it with us. So as trainers, it felt like we were part of the organisation because we knew enough, but not part of the organisation that people could say what they wanted to say without fear of reprisals. And then they actually, after, I think they got through most of their managers, and then they asked for a compassionate leadership programme. And that sort of started my interest in compassionate leadership. But they're a phenomenal organisation, and it was a privilege to work with them. And I know McCrudden Partnership, even though I've moved on, still works with that.
Oh, isn't that fantastic?
Yeah, and they are lovely, lovely people.
Yeah.
So we were very lucky.
Well, that's a good point to pivot towards what you're doing now. So you're currently studying for a PhD at the University of Chichester. It's focusing on developing a more humanistic style of leadership and frontline managers. Can you explain what humanistic leadership means and why it's important?
Okay. So I think in an academic sense, if you looked through literature, you'd probably find slightly different definitions. You know, every academic is looking to put their own brick in the wall of knowledge, and so they'll look for their own interpretation of humanistic. For me, it's just about remembering that the people you're working with are human beings, not human doings.
Oh, I love that.
They are flawed. They are imperfect. Their energy levels will wax and wane. But pretty much none of them get up in the morning and think, if I work really hard today, by the end of the day, my boss will hate me. No one is going out putting in a ton of effort to wind up their colleagues. It can, when people are struggling at work, it comes out in lots of ways. For some people, it comes out emotionally. For some people, it comes out as anger. For some people, it comes out as withdrawing and not performing. And often what we label as unhelpful behaviour is a sign that someone is struggling or suffering. And to me, when we remember that we're working with human beings, we actually get the best out of them. Because I was talking to one of my friends, a former trainer, the other day, and he gave me a wonderful story about how he was teaching a leadership course, and someone said, "Why don't my staff ever come to me with their problems?" And it turned out that what was happening was the manager in the situation celebrated successes all the time, but never shared any of his failings.
Oh.
So when he made a mistake, he would never tell anyone. He would only show them when he'd fixed it, the end result. And so what, of course, transpired was the staff thought he was perfect.
Yeah.
And they thought, well, I can't come to him. If I go to him with my mistakes, I'm losing face.
Wow.
So, and as soon as my colleague, he said, oh, as soon as I pointed it out to them, the manager was like, oh, that's obvious. Why have I never thought of that before? Yeah. And I would say, even as a manager myself, I often thought I needed to be perfect.
I think that's often the case, isn't it?
Yeah. And a few years ago, I will admit, I was, hand on heart, I'd probably had enough of training. And I was struggling. I was exhausted. And for once in my life, I was honest. And I took my colleague, she worked, sort of managed all the back office and like the operations side of things. And I took her out for coffee and I told her I was struggling. And she blew me away. She said, right, that's it. You're having next week off. I don't care. There's no arguments. I'm clearing your diary. And I started to well up because I'd never...
Amazing.
Because I'd not been honest before. I'd never had that support. And, you know, it was exactly what I needed to know that when I was struggling, someone would be there for me. But I think often, and you know, the kindness report from the research on kindness centre says that often kindness isn't shown to managers. Yeah. Maybe that's because managers don't reveal their vulnerability as much as we could. Yeah. So why do I think it's important? Because if you want the best out of people, you need to treat them as human beings. And when you do that, they'll be loyal, they'll help you when you're struggling, they'll perform, and they'll have your back. Yeah,
it's amazing. Yeah, but it's so true. It really, yeah. So what inspired you to pursue this specific area of research for your PhD?
Well, I mean, my PhD is very much focused on compassion in the workplace. And as I said, the organisation I was working with wanted compassionate leadership, and I started scratching my head and thinking, what is it exactly you want me to teach people? So I started hunting around, and I was never really 100% happy with what I found. And I found some, in fact, a very well-known book, and I read it from cover to cover, and it talked about how important compassionate leadership is in terms of outcomes, and it talked about some of the steps involved in being compassionate. And then there was a line in it that said, these are innate skills that are easy. And I felt myself getting angry. So after 10 years of teaching people, I know these skills are not easy, especially not in a workplace. You know, when it comes to compassion for our families, we love our families. In the majority of cases, we know our family members really, really well. We know whether it's appropriate to give them a hug or whether they don't like being touched. Or we read the situation. With a stranger, it's slightly different, but you know, you're not going to see this person again. In a workplace, you have that slightly different relationship in that they're not your family. They're not strangers. No. They may or may not be their friends. You might not even like them particularly. But on top of that, you're also relying on them to do a job. So as much as compassion is important, and I wholeheartedly believe compassion is important, we also have to remember that people only work to do a job. So they still have to perform as well as... So you've got all of that complexity. Plus, I do think that actually listening to people, really listening to people, is hard. Really hard. And it's not doesn't come naturally to everyone. It can be learned, but it doesn't come naturally. Yeah. And empathy is not always easy. I have obviously the two different types of empathy. There's the emotional empathy, where you connect with how people are feeling, and the cognitive empathy, where you academically understand someone's feelings. I have a very strong emotional empathy response. When I would line manage people, if they cried, I would well up. And what I needed to be able to do was remind myself that it's almost like them us separation. That's their feelings, not mine. But that's not easy to manage that. So there's a lot of complex skills in there. And when I read this book that was very dismissive of, well, we should just all be able to do it innately, I thought, well, that upsets me to read a really important book saying that, which is then the PhD came about because I wanted to say to people, don't expect yourself to be brilliant at this, because it's complex.
I delivered a workshop earlier this week about kindness and emotional intelligence, exactly the same. I was like, you'll need to practice it. You have to.
And they're all learnable skills. I mean, empathy, totally. we can get better at empathy. We may have a fixed in terms of mirror neurons, and that emotional empathy, we have a fixed number of mirror neurons. We can't change that, but we can get better at it. And if you're like me and you clearly have too many mirror neurons, then you can learn to manage that reaction, so that, because it was humiliating. You go into a one-to-one and someone would do something emotional, and I'd be sitting there with tears rolling down my face, and they're thinking, why are you crying?
It's like you're taking the spotlight.
It's just about me, not you.
So you've talked a bit about this, but how do you define compassion in the context of leadership, and why is it a crucial component in effective management?
Okay, so the literal definition of compassion, and if you look at the academic literature, it will tell you that compassion is an emotion, like happiness, sadness, fear, anger. It's an emotional response that is triggered by the suffering of someone else. And it leads you to want to understand them and help them. Now that's compassion. My interest is in how we express that emotion. So my interest is in compassionate interacting, or compassionate relating, however you want to express it. Why is it? And interesting, I mean, it's interesting that we've both been talking about managers and leaders, but for me, the word leadership is slightly misleading, perhaps, because you can't make one person in your team solely responsible for compassion.
Exactly.
Everybody should be showing compassion to each other. And that should go up as well as down and sideways. And so when I talk about leadership, I'm talking about not positional leadership, but an ability when someone is struggling, whether that's the new apprentice, whether that's your friend and colleague, or whether that's someone who's worked here for 20 years longer than me, when they are struggling, I will lead that situation and show compassion. That, for me, is the definition of leadership. And the definition of compassion is not just feeling for someone. It's actually, how do I interact with them and help them. And the other bit that's really important for me is so that we both walk away feeling better. Because it's not unheard of for people to come to their colleagues who are struggling with their heart in the right place and do something that inadvertently makes the situation worse. Some people call that idiot's compassion. The classic example that I was given about this was after the liberation of the concentration camps, when the soldiers who liberated the camps saw people who were starving and gave them their rations, which people who'd been chronically starved, their bodies weren't able to cope with it, and it caused an incredible number of extra deaths. Because they needed strategic refeeding, not the rations.
Yeah.
But it was done with the heart in the right place. And
totally. Yeah.
An extreme example, but it happens in workplaces where, with the best will in the world, sometimes we make it worse.
Yes.
Or the flip side of that is sometimes you go in to help and the sufferer ends up feeling better, but you end up feeling worse.
Yeah.
So for me, we're in defining compassionate relating.
Yeah.
The add-on, which is important, is healthy.
Yes.
Healthy, compassionate relating, which ultimately means everyone involved feels better, not worse.
Yeah, that would be a good result. Yeah. I'm writing that down. So, can you share some of the key findings or insights from your research so far and how compassion impacts frontline management?
Okay. In terms of how it impacts, it has a lot of huge, at an organizational level, it has a lot of huge benefits. So it increases the number of the retention of staff. It increases staff loyalty to the organization and therefore productivity. At a team level, when someone, I mean, I just spoke about the sufferer and the helper, if you like. I'm not sure I like those phrases, but it also has been shown to positively impact anyone who witnesses that event as well.
Yes.
So anyone who sees it feels better for having seen an act of compassion.
Yeah.
And you know that I have an issue with compassion fatigue because as a phrase, because because compassion should leave you with a happy emotion. When we talk about compassion fatigue, it's often because we're stuck with the empathy, the pain that people like me would feel.
Yeah.
When we help someone, we get the release of the happiness trifecta hormones. So in terms of how it impacts, it impacts because it makes you feel better. It makes the sufferer feel better. It makes anyone that witnesses it feel better. Yeah. It also, I think, when people reveal their suffering to you, it helps to build an element of trust. Yeah. It requires some trust, but it builds trust. And the more trust we have in a relationship, a team relationship, the more able people are to share their vulnerabilities, their suffering. So if one person does it and they're treated well, the next person who's struggling might feel safer to do it. So it builds a better team. And in terms of that compassionate relating, some of the early findings that I've been looking at is that it does help if you have an existing relationship with the person. It's not essential, but it helps because, as we know, often when people are suffering, they'll just give you the tip of the iceberg. Yes. They'll come to you and they'll say, I'm struggling because I've got this huge report and I can't get it done. What they're not telling you is they've got elderly parents who are, perhaps one of them's in hospital and they're ferrying the other one back and forth, and they've got childcare issues and they're dealing with, I don't know, the menopause, or they've been suffering with a cold themselves for 3 weeks. They'll just tell you about the report. And when you are talking to someone you have an existing relationship with it, and you know a little bit about that personal background, you see the bigger jigsaw. Yeah, definitely. And so suffering that you might immediately go, well, just do the report quickly. It doesn't have to be detailed. Yeah. When you know the bigger picture, you know that that's potentially just the straw that broke the camel's back. Exactly. And the other thing that's coming out is quite important, so that it's healthy for the giver of compassion, is knowing that it helped. Yeah. So getting that sort of feedback loop, which was interesting because that was not something that even occurred to me. No. So, if you are someone who's offered compassion to a colleague and you don't feel like you know if it helped, go and ask. Just go and drop in and say, I was just checking in. How are things now? Yeah. Because what will make you feel better is getting a little bit of feedback that they appreciated you listening, or the advice you suggested worked. Yeah. And that was one of my exciting learning moments when this came out of the interviews I was doing, that feedback. That's fascinating. Yeah. Was really important to the giver.
Yeah. So, in your research, have you encountered any common challenges that managers face in adopting a more compassionate leadership style, and how can they overcome these challenges?
Oh, yes. I mean, one of the questions we asked was about barriers. And it won't surprise you or anyone else to know that the first highest ranking one was time.
Yeah.
Haven't got the time to do it. Overcoming that is realizing that it doesn't have to take long.
Yeah.
Just a touch of an arm, or just looking at someone and going, well, that sucks, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, geez, how are you getting on? Yeah, that is really tough. That's compassion. It's a few seconds. But also, if you do take longer, if you do take 20 minutes, half an hour to listen to someone, it's an investment of time that pays dividends.
Yes. Yes.
And instances like examples of someone comes in and they're struggling, and they've got a really heavy meeting to go to, and you might say to them, well, tell you what, I'm doing some admin today. Do you want to do my admin and I'll go to your meeting?
Yeah.
The upshot might be that they stay at work and do your admin.
Yeah.
And your admin gets done and the meeting gets covered. If you don't do that, they could quite easily go home before the meeting. You're asked to cover it and now no one's doing your admin.
Yeah, that's true.
So at least if you can,
yeah,
in terms of overcoming that time barrier, try and think about it as an investment of time, not a time cost. Some of the other things that came up, the really slightly worrying one, was the second biggest barrier that was presented was personal characteristics.
Oh.
So the second most commonly given answer was that people don't do it because they're selfish, they don't care, they're narcissistic, or they're biased. And I that one made me slightly nervous.
Yes.
And I think there's probably a bit of re-education.
Yeah.
Because compassion as an emotion is innate. It's hardwired into us to be compassionate. We are more compassionate to people we see as our in-group.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So, family and friends, because it's a survival instinct. We are compassionate to our in-group because we want our line to survive.
Yeah.
So in a workplace, if we can build strong teams and we see our colleagues as our in-group, then compassion will happen naturally.
Yeah.
I don't think there are that many narcissists around, true narcissists. I think there are people who have bad days.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And behave in a way that's self-protecting.
Yeah.
So, the personal characteristics one scared me a bit. And the third highest ranking barrier was interpersonal skills.
Yeah, I can see that.
Which links back to actually, you've got to be able to have this conversation with someone who's distressed without getting distressed yourself.
Yeah.
You've also got to know how to help, and for some people, consoling and commiserating and comforting comes really easily. And for some people, it doesn't.
Yeah.
My darling husband, if he can't fix something, he finds it incredibly difficult because he's a fixer.
Yeah.
So if someone's really upset and there's nothing he can do, he finds it really challenging. So having the interpersonal skills just to go, oh, well, that sucks.
Yeah.
Or do you want a hug?
Yeah.
He's constantly looking for the solution. So there's a lot of interpersonal skills at play. Yeah. So it makes sense that it becomes a barrier. How do you overcome that? You learn about what compassion is. You learn about my research.
Yes.
And then you try and reflect on what you are good at, because we all have innate abilities. Some people are naturally really good at the comforting, consoling, but they're terrible at the problem solving. Yeah. My husband's brilliant at problem solving. He's less good at comforting. And so it's becoming self-aware and thinking, right, so what are they looking for when someone wants comfort and consoling? What is it they need me to do?
Yes. What's the problem?
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. And you have expertise in various areas, including compassionate leadership, empathy in the workplace, and communication. And how do you see these elements transforming modern workplaces?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think modern workplaces are transforming by themselves.
Yeah.
And to a point where these skills and qualities are going to be essential.
Yeah.
I mean, the next generation are so much better at recognizing when they're struggling and vocalizing it. You know, sort of that generation of people who are very British, stoic, stiff upper lip, I'll keep going until I drop.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those people, they're still there, and it's not healthy.
No.
But as line managers, we can't undo a lifetime's worth of programming.
No.
That says do not talk about your vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
But as that generation move out of the workforce and the next generation come in, where people are going to be very transparent about, I am struggling with this, compassion and empathy are no longer isn't it a nice way to support people who are, you know, struggling, and when they finally break, we'll show it. It's going to be required every day.
Yes.
And it's a healthier way of being.
Yeah.
Because like we said at the beginning, they're human beings, and human beings will suffer.
Yeah.
Whether that's caused by the organization in terms of unfair policies or practices or workload or time pressures, or whether that's personal suffering following them into the workplace, you know, the death of a pet, or just my washing machine's broken down and I can't afford to fix it. How am I going to cope with this from now on?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right the way up to the really serious suffering of, you know, bereavement or life-threatening illness. So it's always going to be there. The next generation are more open about it, and so people, colleagues, being able to show compassion and demonstrate empathy, the workplace is only going to work when we can do that. And you know, it will become a happier place to work.
Oh, definitely. Oh yeah, totally. And it goes back to what you were saying earlier about, like, different people will have straws that break them. Different people will have things that just really, like, for some people, their washing machine breaking won't be an issue. If you can't afford to fix it, or you've got a mountain of washing.
Yeah, or you've got, you know,
more stressful.
Yeah, you've maybe got, I don't know, ill children or whatever that you need to wash bedding.
All of those things.
Yeah, because we don't know other people's lives unless we ask the question and sit and listen.
Yeah, definitely. Totally. So, in your view, how can leaders effectively communicate and influence while maintaining empathy and compassion?
Okay, so this is a really interesting one. That compassion is often thought about as being pink and fluffy.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be. I had a really interesting conversation really early on. I did some work with the training company with a very male orientated environment in which they were quite tough on each other. And one of the things that I was chatting it through with a friend, and they said to me, you know, but maybe they actually see that as compassion. You know, when someone's struggling and they say, oh, yeah, just get over it, maybe to them that is compassion. And it reminded me of a situation when I was selling my company. Things weren't going particularly well at one point, and I was having a bit of a tough day, and I went for a walk with my cousin and I was telling her about it, and all of a sudden she just said to me, oh, for goodness sake, Nicola, you're behaving like a spoiled brat. She calls me Nicola. Not many people do unless I'm in trouble. She said, you're behaving like a spoiled brat. Stop throwing your toys at the pram. And I just remember stopping in the middle of Eastbourne Seafront with my mouth wide open, thinking, oh. And I stopped for a second, and then I realised she was right. However, I'm not suggesting people go out and say things like that, because obviously my cousin has known me my entire life, and up until this point has been incredibly supportive. And she knew me well enough to know what I needed right there was a metaphorical slap across the face to bring me some perspective. So what I'm saying is, in terms of compassion, tough love can be compassionate, but there has to be an equal level of support that's happened beforehand. So the tougher the wake-up call, the more support there needs to have been before. So when it comes to things like holding boundaries and communicating and influencing, you can absolutely ask people to do things and expect people to do their job and hold a boundary and and influence them to work hard, as long as you've shown them the same level of support previously.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I think when it comes to influence, influence is always a tricky one. I used to teach influencing skills. And one of the things I used to say to people is, you have to use these. This is a bit like Star Wars. The skills you teach on an influencing skills course, you can't turn to the dark side and use it to get your own way all the time. It has to be used for good.
Used for good, yeah.
So when you're influencing people, and there are some of the influencing techniques are about understanding someone else's world, and then dovetailing what you need to show how it meets their needs. So I think when it comes to leading and influencing, I suppose it comes back to that humanistic. You've got to support the struggling as much as you demand the high levels of performance.
Yes.
It's that balance, that equity.
Yeah, totally.
And when that's out of whack, one way or the other, it becomes a problem.
Yeah.
So if you demand too much and you don't support struggling, you're going to have people who are unhappy and leave. Yeah. And if you indulge too much suffering and don't get the performance, then you're essentially being unfair to the rest of your team.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because they're picking up the slack.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a balance point, I think.
Yeah, that's something I talk a lot with the kindness as well, and empathy. It all comes. Yeah. And then finally, what's one piece of advice you would give leaders who are striving to lead with kindness and compassion in today's challenging work environments?
Okay. So people are striving to do it. I would say don't expect to be perfect at it first time out. Yeah. In fact, I would suggest don't ever expect to be perfect at it. No. And one of the things that sometimes pips people off is a fear that they might have misread the situation, that they might have, their help might be misinterpreted or not wanted. Don't let that put you off. But the other thing I would say is remember that you're dealing with another adult. Yeah. I had a really interesting conversation with a friend about there was a homeless gentleman who was outside the shop, and she went into the shop and bought him something to eat, and she said he was decidedly underwhelmed. So in terms of that feedback loop, she was like, well, I didn't really get the feedback I was looking for. And we were talking about it. And I said, well, that was a nice thing to do. But the truly compassionate thing to do would be to ask him what he wanted first. Because compassion is based on understanding. Yeah. And for all we know, he might have said, I've been given 4 sandwiches already today. What I really want is a cup of coffee, if you wouldn't mind, from the vending machine. Or maybe I don't want anything from the shop. Maybe I just want someone to talk to me like a human being for a while. Yeah. So it comes back to that idiot's compassion. Yeah. So what I would say to anyone who's striving to be kind and compassionate is try not to work from your assumptions. It's really hard. Yeah. But try and ask people how you can help. Yeah. Brilliant. What a brilliant way to end. Oh, so thank you. It's been a joy talking to you. Thank you. I love talking to you. Thank you for sharing your insights and experiences today. We appreciate your time and the valuable lessons you've imparted to our listeners. Until next time, continue to lead with kindness. Thank you for joining us on Lead with Kindness. I hope today's episode has inspired you and equipped you with practical insights to bring more kindness and well-being into your leadership journey. Remember, the transformation towards a kinder workplace starts with us, and every small step counts. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share it with fellow leaders, and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us grow and reach more people committed to positive change. I'm Helen Rimmer, and it's been a pleasure to be part of your leadership journey today. Until next time, keep leading with kindness and fostering well-being in all that you do. Goodbye and take care.